Imagine an empire that dominated the known world for centuries, a giant of stone and iron that seemed invincible. Then, in less than 300 years, that giant began to collapse, piece by piece, until it vanished. But what transformed the Roman Empire from an unstoppable power to a faded memory? Hello, everyone, and welcome to a journey through one of the most tumultuous and fascinating periods in Roman history, the period from the 2nd to the 5th century AD. We are not just talking about the end of an empire, but of a profound metamorphosis that redefined the course of the entire Western civilization. Today, we will discover together how the Golden Age slowly crumbled, how bold reforms attempted to save it, and how, despite everything, the Roman West yielded, leaving a legacy that still defines us today. Get ready, because the story we are about to tell you is much more than just a news story. It is a lesson in power, change, and resilience. Think of the Roman Empire as a colossus. After centuries of expansion, conquests, and an organization that we still study with admiration today, its peak was reached between the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. This is often called the Golden Age, a period of relative stability and prosperity. Cities flourished, roads were safe, trade thrived across the Mediterranean, and Rome was the beating heart of a civilized world. The empire, stretching from one end of Europe to the other and beyond, with its laws, its culture, and its infrastructure, seemed an impregnable stronghold, the pinnacle of ancient civilization. The borders were defended by an efficient army, the bureaucracy functioned, and a relative internal peace allowed for widespread well being, at least for those who were Roman citizens. It was an era when one could travel from Hispania to Syria speaking the same language, trading in the same currency, under the same legal system. The great adoptive emperors of the 2nd century, from Trajan to Hadrian to Marcus Aurelius, had managed this immense organism with wisdom and foresight, bringing it to a level of efficiency and grandeur rarely equaled in history. However, even giants have their Achilles heels. Beneath this veneer of splendor, the first signs of weakness were beginning to appear like invisible cracks in a towering statue. They were whispers, small warnings that would soon turn into a deafening scream. The weakening factors were multiple and interconnected. Political instability became a recurring plague. Imagine an emperor who lasted only a few months, sometimes even a few weeks, before being assassinated and replaced by another ambitious general. This is not just a news item, it is an earthquake for the foundations of a state. This continuous ballet of usurpers weakened central authority, making the empire vulnerable. Then there was inflation. We talk about it often today, but imagine what it meant in an ancient economy. To pay for their ever growing army and growing state expenditures, the emperors began to debase the currency, reducing the amount of precious metal in the coins. The result: prices skyrocketed, purchasing power plummeted, and confidence in the economic system collapsed. Trade became difficult, people struggled to make a living, and the economy contracted, leading to general impoverishment. Added to all this were external pressures. At the borders of the empire, new and increasingly aggressive peoples were pressing hard. The Germans to the north, the Sassanids to the east, they were no longer just small raids but real organized threats, which forced Rome to maintain an enormous, expensive, and constantly pressured army. The once invincible legions were now worn down by constant warfare and long periods of service away from home. The main consequence of all this was military anarchy. This is not a poetic way of describing some disorder, but a well defined historical period, which runs roughly from 235 to 284 AD. During these 50 years, the empire saw around 30 legitimate emperors and an even greater number of usurpers. Each legion, each provincial army felt it could elect its own emperor. It was an escalation of violence, continuous civil wars for power, generals clashing with each other, leaving the empire at the mercy of looting and destruction. Internal struggles were so violent that they were often more dangerous than external enemies. Cities were besieged and destroyed by the Romans themselves, agriculture was devastated, and communication routes were unsafe. Imagine the chaos, the fear, the total uncertainty of the future. This period of military anarchy only further weakened the empire, draining its resources, eroding its authority, and preparing it for an even deeper crisis. The Colossus was wounded, bleeding, and beginning to stagger. Faced with an empire that seemed on the brink of collapse, one man decided it was time to act decisively. That man was Diocletian, who ascended the throne in 284 AD. He was a pragmatic military man, a man who understood that half measures would not save Rome. His reforms were radical, a true structural facelift for an ailing empire. His masterpiece was the institution of the Tetrarchy, a system of government by four. The idea was simple but revolutionary. The empire was too vast to be governed by a single man, and succession was a constant source of civil war. Thus, Diocletian divided the empire into two large areas, east and west, At the head of each he placed an Augustus, the chief emperor. And to ensure an orderly succession, each Augustus chose a Caesar, a sort of vice emperor and designated successor, who would assume the title of Augustus after a certain period. Thus there were two Augusti and two Caesars, 4 men in command, yet each responsible for a part of the empire. The objective was clear: to stabilize power, ensure a peaceful transition, and more effectively manage an immense territory threatened on several fronts. It worked for a while, bringing a period of relative calm and order after decades of chaos. But Diocletian didn't stop there. His administrative reforms were equally profound. By dividing the existing provinces into smaller entities, he sought to make the administration more widespread and responsive, reducing the power of individual governors and making them more controllable from the center. This, of course, increased bureaucracy, but for Diocletian, order and control were a priority. He also strengthened the army, increasing its size and reorganizing it to make it more efficient in defending the long borders. He stabilized the economy, albeit with draconian methods such as the edict on maximum prices, an attempt to combat inflation that, however, had little success. His reforms overall gave the empire a breath of fresh air, lifting it back from the abyss. But they were so centralized and heavy that, in the long run, they created new tensions. Then came Constantine. If Diocletian was the physician who healed the wounds of the empire, Constantine was the architect who redesigned its future, but with a different, often revolutionary imprint. He also continued administrative and military reforms, but he is remembered above all for two epochal decisions. The first is the Edict of Milan of 313 AD. This was not an edict proclaiming Christianity the state religion as many mistakenly believe. It was something equally, if not more, significant for its time, a decree that guaranteed freedom of worship to all citizens of the empire, putting an end to the persecution of Christians. Imagine what it meant for thousands of people who for centuries had been forced to hide their faith or face torture and death. From day to night, they could openly profess their faith. Constantine not only recognized Christianity but actively supported it, convinced that the God of the Christians had helped him win crucial battles, such as that of the Milvian Bridge. This edict was a turning point, a true watershed in the religious and social history of the empire, and laid the foundations for the rise of Christianity. The second decision was the foundation of a new capital, Constantinople. Another bold move, moving the heart of the empire from Rome, now perceived as a symbol of the pagan past and militarily exposed, to a new city on the Bosphorus, ancient Byzantium. This new Rome, inaugurated in 330 AD, was strategically positioned to defend the eastern borders and quickly became a center of power, culture, and wealth, destined to be the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire for more than 1,000 years after the fall of the West. Constantine, with his reforms and decisions, not only saved the empire from imminent collapse, but also charted its course for the centuries to come, projecting it towards a new era, an era that would be profoundly marked by the Christian faith. We have just talked about the Edict of Milan, which granted freedom of worship to Christians. But the story of Christianity in the Roman Empire is a fascinating parable of resilience and transformation, one that goes far beyond simple tolerance. Consider that for the first centuries, Christians were viewed with suspicion, often hated and persecuted. They were considered subversive because they refused to worship the Roman gods and the emperor, which was seen as an act of political insubordination. Their secret meetings, their internal solidarity, their rites were seen as mysterious and dangerous practices. Accused of everything from cannibalism to atheism, they were subjected to waves of persecution, often brutal, culminating with that of Diocletian, who attempted to eradicate the Christian faith once and for all. Yet, despite the violence, or perhaps because of it, Christianity continued to spread. His promise of salvation, the equality of men before God, and mutual support within communities made inroads into an often hierarchical and harsh society. From the fringes, Christianity became an increasingly influential social and spiritual force, penetrating every strata of Roman society, from soldiers to slaves, from merchants to aristocrats. It was a silent, underground, but unstoppable force. Then, with Constantine, recognition came. The Edict of Milan was the first step. But the real culmination, the moment when Christianity passed from a tolerated religion to a state religion, occurred under the Emperor Theodosius III at the end of the 4th century. In 380 AD, Theodosius issued the Edict of Thessalonica, proclaiming Christianity in its Nicene form as the sole official religion of the Roman Empire. This was a radical change, an epochal turning point that had immense repercussions. From being persecuted, Christians became the favorites, and the once clandestine churches began to receive state support to erect magnificent buildings to see their bishops acquire ever-increasing authority, often comparable to that of imperial officials. Christian holidays entered the official calendar, pagan symbols were progressively removed, and pagan temples were closed or transformed. This consolidated the power of the Christian Church but also had a profound impact on Roman society. Christian morality began to influence laws, traditions, and even ways of thinking. Concepts such as charity, forgiveness, brotherhood, although already present in other forms, acquired a new meaning and a new centrality. However, this change was not painless. The Christianization of the empire also led to new forms of intolerance. If previously it was Christians who were persecuted, now it was the pagans who found themselves in the minority, seeing their traditions and beliefs banned, sometimes with violence. Despite this, the integration of Christianity into the fabric of the empire was complete. Language, art, and philosophy changed. The figures of saints and martyrs replaced those of mythological heroes. The church became not only a spiritual institution but also an important social structure, which in many areas, especially in the West, became the only point of reference for the populations in the face of the progressive crumbling of state structures. Christianity, from a marginal movement, had become the cultural and spiritual glue of an empire that was seeking a new identity. Despite the bold reforms of Diocletian and Constantine, despite the injection of new spiritual life brought by Christianity, the Western Roman Empire was unable to overcome its difficulties. Short-term solutions couldn't stem a mountain of problems that had accumulated over the centuries. Imagine trying to hold together a castle whose foundations are crumbling and whose walls are constantly under attack. The final blow came from what we call the barbarian invasions. This term, perhaps a little reductive, actually refers to a period of great migrations and incursions by populations who lived beyond the Roman borders. People such as the Goths, the Vandals, the Huns, the Franks, and many others. They were not always bloodthirsty invaders. Sometimes they were people seeking new lands, protection, or simply a slice of Roman wealth. But their pressure on the borders became unsustainable. Everything came to a head at the end of the 4th century. In 378 AD, the Goths inflicted a devastating defeat on the Roman army at the Battle of Adrianople, even killing the Emperor Valens. It was a tremendous shock, a demonstration that the invincible Roman legion was no longer such. Then at the beginning of the 5th century, the situation deteriorated. In 406 AD, a coalition of Germanic peoples broke through the Rhine limes, spreading into Gaul. A few years later, in 410 AD, the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome itself, the Eternal City. It wasn't the end of the empire, but it was a psychological trauma and a powerful symbol. If Rome could fall, then nothing was untouchable. The invasions continued. The Vandals established themselves in North Africa, cutting off Rome's grain supplies and tax revenues from one of its richest provinces. Attila's Huns, whose reputation was that of a divine scourge, spread terror in Gaul and Italy. External pressure was relentless and combined lethally with the empire's internal weaknesses. The army was increasingly barbarized, composed largely of mercenaries or Germanic federates who often had more loyalty to their leaders than to the Roman emperor. The economy was on its knees, taxes were not collected, cities were depopulating, and Roman elites retreated to their fortified villas, losing interest in running the state. The imperial governments, which were often in the hands of generals of barbarian origin, had less and less control over the provinces. The barbarians did not want to destroy the empire, they wanted to live within it, benefiting from its wealth and prestige. But their massive presence and Rome's inability to assimilate or repel them inevitably led to the fragmentation of power. The western provinces broke away one after another, forming autonomous Romano-barbarian kingdoms. Britain was abandoned, Gaul and Spain were occupied. The curtain fell in 476 AD. That year, a general of Germanic origin, Odoacer, deposed the last Western Roman emperor, a boy named Romulus Augustulus. It was not a dramatic event like the sack of Rome, it was almost a bureaucratic act. Romulus Augustus was not killed, but simply deposed and sent to Campania. Odoacer did not take the title of emperor for himself, but sent the imperial insignia to the Eastern emperor, Zeno, recognizing his sovereignty and proclaiming himself king in Italy. This marked the end of an era. It was not a sudden explosion, but rather a long and inexorable process of decadence, lasting centuries, culminating in the dissolution of a central power that was no longer capable of governing. 476 AD is a symbolic date, a dividing line that many historians use to indicate the end of antiquity and the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed, but its legacy, its laws, its language, its culture, and the Christian religion it had embraced would continue to shape the new chapter of European history. It was the end of a world, but also the birth of another, deeply imbued with what Rome had been.